When you hear the word cowboy, what's the first image that comes to your mind? You probably see a lone rider, a dusty street, and a quick-draw duel. A man of few words, a hero or an outlaw, with a six-shooter on his hip and a score to settle. That's the image Hollywood burned into our minds, a myth forged against smoke and grit. But what if that's only half the story? What if the true history of the American West wasn't written in gunfights, but in the sweat of honest work, in endless stretches of land, and in the quiet dreams of ordinary men? What if the real cowboy was more than just a gunfighter? They were dreamers, workers, and wanderers of the frontier, the forgotten heroes who built the West mile by lonely mile. This is the story of one such man. His name was Jedediah Stone, but his friends just called him Jed. He wasn't born a hero. He didn't have a hardened past or a reputation to defend. Jed was a farmer's son from Ohio, and like so many others in the late 1870s, he traded the familiarity of his home for the promise of the unknown. His tools weren't a pair of revolvers, but a well-loved guitar and a hand-drawn map. He was just a boy with an optimistic heart and an old dream, a dream of finding a place where he truly belonged, out on the vast, untamed frontier. He arrived in a small, sun-bleached town in Texas, a place that felt more like a rest stop than a destination. It wasn't a town of shootouts and saloons. It was a town of dusty storefronts and quiet hope. Jed didn't come looking for trouble. He came looking for a job. A cattle drive was heading north, and he was hoping to get on the crew. He was a long way from home, and the world he'd read about in dime novels felt a lot bigger and a lot more dangerous than he ever imagined. The real conflict wasn't with a rival gang, but with the sheer, overwhelming emptiness of the land, and the question of whether a dreamer like him could ever survive in a world so harsh and unforgiving. Jed got his job, signing on with a seasoned trail boss named Hank and a small, no-nonsense crew. This wasn't the heroic posse of Hollywood lore. They were a motley group of weathered men, each with his own silent story, united by the hard work of moving 2,000 head of cattle from Texas to Kansas. Hank, with a face like a dried-out riverbed, watched Jed with a calm, appraising gaze. He didn't ask about Jed's past or his dreams. He simply watched how Jed handled a rope and a saddle. Jed quickly learned that a cowboy's real enemies weren't other men, but the elements. The sun was a relentless tyrant, burning his skin and cracking the earth. The dust was a constant, choking companion, coating his throat and his clothes. For the first few days, his body ached in ways he didn't know were possible. His hands, one soft from holding a pen, grew callous from the reins. The endless, monotonous rhythm of the trail was a stark contrast to his youthful fantasies. He wasn't a hero on a quest. He was a worker, a tiny speck in a vast and indifferent landscape. But it was in this very monotony that Jed started to discover the true heart of the cowboy's life. It wasn't about the grand gestures, but the small, quiet moments. He learned to read the sky for a coming storm, to calm a restless steer with a low whistle, and to find the hidden poetry in the endless expanse of the prairie. Hank, a man of few words, taught him these things without saying much at all. He taught him to respect the herd, to listen to the land, and to trust the men riding alongside him. They weren't just a crew. They were a unit, a brotherhood forged in shared hardship. One afternoon, the sky turned a bruised purple, and a vicious thunderstorm rolled in with a speed that defied belief. A crack of lightning sent the herd into a frantic stampede. It was chaos, a tidal wave of muscle and fear. Jed, terrified but clear-headed, didn't try to be a hero. He remembered Hank's earlier words about a stampede. You don't fight it. You ride with it. Try to turn him. Using his horse, his instinct, and the shared knowledge of the crew, he helped guide the stampeding cattle into a wide circle, gradually slowing them down. He was no longer just a boy from Ohio. He was a valuable member of the crew. That night, huddled around a crackling campfire, the tension of the day still lingering in the air, Jed pulled out his guitar. He played a simple tune, a melody he'd learned from his mother. At first, the other men just listened, their faces illuminated by the firelight. But soon, the quiet tunes turned into songs, and the songs turned into shared stories. We saw these men not as hardened, silent figures, but as people with fears, hopes, and memories. There was a young man who missed his sweetheart back east, the old-timer who spoke of family he hadn't seen in years. Jed's music bridged the gap between their isolated lives, proving that a cowboy's true strength wasn't just in his hands, but in his ability to find a spark of humanity in the vast loneliness. The trail presented one challenge after another. They crossed a wide, treacherous river, its current strong enough to swallow a horse. Jed, remembering Hank's lessons on river behavior and his own intuition, was key in guiding the herd. It was a perilous journey, but they made it through, soaked but safe. A few days later, they had a tense encounter with a small gang of men who fit the Hollywood cowboy stereotype, all swagger and no substance. They demanded a toll to cross their territory. Hank, without a single word of bravado, simply guided the herd around them, taking the long way instead of a confrontational one. This was a critical lesson for Jed. The real cowboys didn't seek out trouble. They sought to avoid it. Their job was to preserve the herd in their lives, not to prove their courage in a meaningless fight. The climax of their journey was a relentless, sudden blizzard. It descended upon them without warning, a white wall of blinding snow and bone-chilling wind. The cattle, disoriented, scattered. The crew, separated, fought to survive. Jed, battling the freezing winds, was a long way from the boy who had left Ohio. He was a man of the plains now. He focused on a single, guiding star he knew from Hank's lessons and pressed on. He found Hank, thrown from his horse and with a badly injured leg. He had a choice: save himself or save the man who had taught him everything. Without a second thought, Jed helped Hank to his feet, guiding him through the blinding storm. The real fight wasn't against an enemy. It was a desperate battle against nature, with the life of a friend at stake. Jed, with Hank's arm over his shoulder, fought his way through the blizzard. The wind howled like a banshee, and every step was a struggle. His hands, once soft, were now frozen, but he held on to Hank with a strength he never knew he had. He wasn't thinking of glory or fortune. He was thinking of the man who had taught him to survive, the man who had become a friend. They stumbled upon a small, rocky overhang just as exhaustion was about to take them. Jed wrapped Hank in a blanket and started a small fire, the last of their kindling. The climax wasn't a hail of bullets. It was a quiet victory of perseverance over the brutal will of nature. It was in that frigid silence that Jed realized the true purpose of his journey wasn't to find a new life, but to save one. Days later, the sun returned, and what was left of the crew, battered but alive, re-emerged. They gathered the surviving cattle and completed the final leg of their journey. The drive ended not with a hero's welcome or a great fortune, but with a simple handshake and a quiet farewell. Jed had arrived in Texas with a dream of a grand adventure, but he left with something far more valuable: a new sense of self-worth, a profound understanding of what it meant to be a man of the West. He was no longer just a dreamer. He was a true cowboy, defined not by what he carried on his hip, but by the calluses on his hands and the lessons in his heart. The final scene shows Jed sitting by a campfire at dusk. He's still got his old guitar, but his hands are now scarred and tough. The worn-out map lies beside him, but he doesn't need it anymore. He looks out at the endless horizon, the setting sun painting the sky in strokes of orange and purple. The story ends by returning to the original question. When we think of a cowboy, we think of a myth, but the reality was so much richer. The real heroes of the West were the ones who faced down stampedes and blizzards. They were the men who found a way to survive not through force, but through resilience, hard work, and the quiet bonds of brotherhood. The cowboy isn't a gunslinger. He's a dreamer, a wanderer, a builder. He's a symbol of the human spirit of endurance, of the simple desire to find a place in the world, and the courage to keep going mile after lonely mile.